I've been talking for a long time about the importance of culture when it comes to understanding Jesus, understanding the Bible, the sacred scriptures. And I remember when I first went to Israel in November of 2002. That's actually coming up on 19 years now, if you can believe it. But when I first went to Israel and I began to walk around the country and see the places of the Bible, I remember the impact that the culture and the geography of the land had on my own personal life. And I remember coming back home to Canada and being blown away by how much the culture had really affected me. And so I started to travel and go into churches in different cities, first here in Ontario, then across Canada, into the US, Southeast Asia, the UK, you name it. I just began to go everywhere. And at first, I remember people being a little uneasy, saying, Joe, we know you, but what are you doing exactly? Are you going to tell us that we got to start doing certain things, or that there's certain things that we can't do anymore? And the more they began to hear what I was saying, the more they began to understand how important it was to really get into the culture of Jesus. And so today, I'm going to start with a very simple illustration because I want to drive home this point of how important it is to understand a person's culture and their background. Because if you misunderstand, you can really misunderstand the person's intentions. So let me start off by showing you real quick here a picture. And this is all I want you to do. I want you to look at this picture. And then in the comment section below, I want you to tell me which one is the football. That's it. That's your homework for the day. That's the big question for the day. And some of you are looking at this saying, well, Joe, hello, of course, the football is the one on the left, the one on the right. Is it the circle shaped one that's black and white? Is it the one that's kind of like egg shaped and brownish? Which is the right answer? Which is the football? This is what I want to talk about a little bit today, because even in this simple illustration, it tells us how important that the culture we come from can affect the way we see things, even something as simple as football. So I want you to describe for me um, a football game that you recently watched. I want you to tell me about the score. I want you to tell me about the game, what the highlights were. Think about that in your mind. Well, if you live here in North America, on February 7th, 2021, there was a really big game. It's the Bowl of Bowls, it's the Super Bowl. And it's become even such just a part of the culture here. Even people like me who don't watch the NFL, like I don't follow it throughout the year. But when it comes to that big game, everybody gathers around their TV with friends and family. There's pizza and hot dogs and nachos and all kinds of other super healthy snacks I'm sure people are having. Although it looked very different this year, didn't it, because of COVID? But normally it's become such an important part of our culture. And everybody who lives in this country, when you say Super Bowl, you don't have to explain it. You know exactly what it is. Even if you don't even know who's playing, you don't know who the favorites are, you don't know any of that background, you know what the Super Bowl is. And so the Super Bowl this year was apparently very interesting. I just tuned into little parts of it, but the final score was 31-9. And apparently that's, one team really beat the other team. So you hear 31-9 and it's kind of like, yeah, whatever, 40 points in one game. That's not a big deal. It's not that hard of a concept to grasp or to imagine. And so I Googled it a little bit because I was wondering what's the most common, outcome in a sporting game, football specifically. And the most common outcome, the score is 20-17. So in the majority of NFL games, the most common score is 20-17. Now that's 37 points in one game. And when you watch football here and you hear that kind of a score, you think, oh wow, okay, whatever, 20-17. But if you told that score, if you told somebody in Africa or pretty much any other country outside of North America that you watched a football game on the weekend where there was there was 37 points in one game, they'd look at you and say, "What are you talking about? You're nuts. There's no way you can get that many points in one football game. That's outrageous. You're just making that up." And they say you're outrageous. Well, hang on a second. You're thinking, well, why would somebody not believe I told them there was 30 something, points in one game? Let me kind of just give you a different perspective on this. And let me put it to you this way. Let me kind of turn, the tables for a minute. What if I told you that a few years ago, one of the greatest days of my life, one of the highlights from all my travels is that I got to go watch my favorite football team in England. And even more specific than England was I got to go to Manchester and I got to watch my favorite football club anywhere in the world, hands down. And I got to go to 3 games, and it was like there's 70,000 people in the stadium. It was crazy. It was fast paced. They were hitting the crossbar, they were hitting the goalpost. And at the end of the day of this super exciting game, the score was 3-1. And anybody living over there would say, "Oh yeah, 3-1 is a great game. Wow, that's a good amount of goals." But when you talked about the football game here in North America, and there's 40 points in a game, it seems like we're talking about 2 completely different sports, but yet we're using the same word. Oh, we actually are talking about different sports, even though we're using the same word. You see, even though we're using the same word, the games themselves, they couldn't be any more different, right? One is used with your hand to throw a ball. The other one is use your foot to kick a ball. The point structure is different. The rules of the game are different. It's completely different, yet it has the exact same name. So how is that possible? Well, what we call football here in the West, when you travel anywhere else, they call that, American football. It's a very intentional distinction, because if you're over in Africa or in Europe or in Asia and you say, I saw a football game, they're not going to think of the same football that we talk about here in North America. You have to say American football. Oh, American football, NFL, the 49ers, the Buccaneers, those kinds of teams. And what we call soccer over here is what they actually call football. Again, pretty much anywhere outside of North America. So when I say there was 40 points in one game and it was exciting, and I say there was 4 points in this game and that was exciting, is anybody lying? Well, no. Is anybody being deceptive? No. It's just that the culture will totally dictate which game we are referring to and then what the outcome will be. Now, we're talking about something simple like a sport. Imagine what happens when we take this book. Okay, I hope you guys can see that up there. The Bible. What happens when we look at this book? How do we get what it says from where it is into our minds, into our thoughts? Well, we know the difference is the lens. See, because the Bible is here in its original culture, and I'm way over here in my culture. And the way I see this book is when I put a lens in front of it, and whatever lens I put in front of it is going to affect, it's going to distort, it's going to change the way I see the original meaning of what is written there. Now here again, you can see, right, the pages are white. I think pretty much every Bible around the world, whatever version you read or use, the pages are white. But what if I were to take a red glass or a red lens and put it in front of my eyes and then look at the Bible? Well, now the pages are red, even though they're not red. They were never red. They were never meant to be the color red, but because that's the lens I use, that's how I see the words of this page. I think some of you are starting to understand what I'm talking about. So let me give you a really quick example of how the lens that we use can taint or even change the interpretation that the initial authors had in this book. So let me take you to Matthew chapter 16, verse 19. Now, Matthew 16 in general is a really well-known story in the life of Jesus. He takes his disciples and they go up to Caesarea Philippi, way in the north of Israel, right at the base of something called Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon divides today Israel and Lebanon. So it's way in the north. And he takes his disciples there. And we find out that Caesarea Philippi is a hotbed of idolatry, of worshiping false gods. And they have all these idols of different gods in these little niches in the rocks and stuff, and all kinds of false worship is going on. And Jesus asks, in light of all these gods that are here, who do you say that I am? And there's this amazing conversation that goes on between Jesus and the disciples. And then Peter steps up and he says, you're not just another God in the wall. You're not just another statue. You're not a man-made thing. You are the Messiah. And, it's often called the confession of Peter. And it's a historic moment, not just in the life of Peter, but in the life of what would become the church. And because he makes this statement, Jesus says to him in Matthew 16:19, speaking to Peter specifically, and he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, and this is where we're going to start looking at how the lens affects what Jesus is really saying to Peter, and then how we have interpreted it today. So I've given you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound where in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed where? In heaven. And so the most common understanding of this passage is that Jesus is referring to the authority of the believer over spiritual matters and even spiritual entities. And if you do a quick YouTube search on Matthew 16:19 and what it means, you'll get an array, a plethora of different opinions. But what I want to do today is I want to take you back to the original culture and just give you a real quick look at what those terms actually meant in Jesus' day. Binding and loosing weren't new words. It wasn't a new concept that Jesus was introducing. The people already understood those terms, and they were in use in the religious courts. And so they were legal terms, and a first century audience understood and knew them right away. And so they were legal terms used in the religious court of law. And basically, if someone had a dispute over a command in the Torah, they would go before the religious courts in front of a rabbi or a priest, and you would give them what your gripe was with the Torah or what your concern was over an interpretation of something, and then the rabbis would decide. And more times than not, the court would receive inquiries about keeping the Sabbath. The biblical law was very simple. It says, keep the Sabbath by what? Keeping it holy by doing no work on it. Okay, that's very simple. But there's a very broad possibility of answers to that, because what you might consider work, I might not. And what I might consider work, you might not. And on it goes. So you would bring your request to the rabbi and say, hey, can I carry this on the Sabbath from here to there? Or can I do this on the Sabbath? And the rabbi would hear what you have to say. And so if the rabbi deemed that what you were doing was not work, he would say, oh, you are loosed. Okay? You are loosed to go ahead and do that activity. But if the rabbi determined that what you were doing was work and was in violation of the Sabbath law, he would say you are bound from doing that activity. You cannot do it. So the rabbis then had the powers to bind and to loose. You see, just by quickly inserting a first century Hebraic lens, do you see how quickly that verse changes? You see how quickly what Jesus said to Peter wasn't some foreign concept. It wasn't a new theology. It wasn't a new thing. It was something that people already understood. And Jesus was telling Peter that I'm going to give you the authority to make decisions on very important matters in this new movement that he just said, I'm going to call the church. Now, in the New Testament, we already see Peter stepping into this role, this newly appointed position. We see him doing already. It's in Acts chapter 15. And what happens earlier, we're going to look at verse 19 in a second, but before that, we learn that there's a Jewish group in Jerusalem who are not very happy that, the gospel has come to the Gentiles, because the Gentiles don't have to do anything. They don't have to change anything, to be accepted by God. And they're saying, no, they have to be circumcised, and they have to do this, and they have to do all these things of the law. This is the way that it has to be. And so the council, they convene and they meet and they begin to talk about it. And then in Acts chapter 15, verse 19, Peter gives his decision. Therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God. So he says we should not trouble them. So he says they are being loosed from the law, right? There's 613 laws in what we call the Torah. He says that my judgment is that we should not trouble them. So they are loosed from having to keep that law, but we should write them to abstain from, and he gives a list: things polluted by idols, sexual immorality, what has been strangled, and from blood. He says, but these four things they are bound to keep. They are loosed from the law, but these four things they are bound to. And remember, it's exactly what Jesus said to Peter, that whatever you bind and whatever you loose on earth shall be bound and loosed in heaven. And so we see him carrying this out already, even within his lifetime. You see, guys, the lens of culture changes everything. Now, I could go on and on and on and on. I am a preacher, but instead what I want to do is I want to encourage you to continue learning and to continue diving, go deeper into the Hebraic, cultural background of the scripture. So what I'm going to invite you to do is, of course, nobody has to do this, so I'm going to invite you that if you want to learn more about what I just shared, even the simple thing like binding and loosing, just head over to my website, joeamaral.org/shop. You can see it here on the website, and you can just kind of scroll through. You can see there's a lot of different products there that I've been able to write and produce over the years. And you're going to get down to understanding Jesus, which is where I got that teaching of binding and loosing. There's also a lot of other stuff there. There's a bunch of materials there, and everything has been drastically reduced. The prices have gone way down because we want to make sure that those are, that's something that we can get into your hands. So that's it, friends. That's just a quick, overview of how important it is to be mindful of the fact that we are looking at this book through a lens. So let's get it right. Let's get it straight. Let's go back to the original culture and look at it through the Hebraic first century lens. And as we do it, the life and the ministry of Jesus become more and more clear.